Welcome everybody to our webinar this afternoon. We're really excited to have you with us, and as always our panelists around me. So first to my right, I'd like to welcome Michael to us. Michael Cameron is an HR specialist with over 20 years experience in the field. To my right, Nondumiso Stevenson, Dr. Stevenson. She's from Sanofi, joining us today, so thank you to both of you. On my left is Tim de Villiers. Tim is a person living with epilepsy and is going to share his experiences today about the workplace and his journey. And Dr. Pradeep Rowji, our specialist neurologist, who's joining us today to give us the medical views. So my first point of view is to say Epilepsy South Africa welcomes each and every one of you as the only organization that offers support services to persons with epilepsy. And having said that, I'd like to hand over to Nondumiso next to me from Sanofi and just share, why are you here? Why is Sanofi here?
Thanks, Sharlene, and thank you also for the invitation and also to the guests. As you know, Sanofi is known as a pharmaceutical company, but we consider ourselves a health company. So our mission as an organization, or our purpose, is to chase the miracles of science to improve lives, which sounds very lofty, but as a mission, of course. But we realize that through events like this and through various strategic partnerships that we have. So we work at different levels. We work with governments, non-governmental organizations, and importantly, patient advocacy groups like Epilepsy SA. And that is how we feed into that purpose of improving people's lives. So that is why we're here to support you and also to work through you to improve patients' lives.
Absolutely, and thank you, Nondumiso. I mean, everything about Epilepsy South Africa is about enabling people with epilepsy to have quality lives, right?
Correct.
Okay. So, over to you. I think you'd like to speak to our neurologist that's joined us today.
Thanks again, Dr. Rowji, for joining us. I think just to set the tone so that we're all on the same page, and perhaps for people out there who are joining us for the first time or who are just curious about epilepsy, what is epilepsy?
So I'd like to actually make it a simple description. So the simplest description I can make is in the days of old telephones, where you had these networks and it had to go through a central system of boards and then it would be spread to the next person. So too is exactly what the new systems work like, right? So if you phone somebody, it goes through your local network. From that network, it skips to the next network. And that's how you can call somebody in the middle of the planet at any given moment in time, at any time of the day. So these networks are basically the structure of our neural networks are very similar. They work within groups. And when there's a misfire within any of those networks, it results in a disruption of the system. And that's what epilepsy is. It's an outage within a particular group, and it can manifest in the form of a seizure. So you get different types of seizures, and really that's what epilepsy or the concept of a seizure is about, is that at the time when the person's experiencing a seizure, there's a disruption in the electrical networks giving rise to this abnormality that we call a seizure.
So based on what you're saying about the importance of the integrity of that communication, one would imagine that that's very important for a workplace and for one to be productive in the workplace. Can you talk about why we talk about epilepsy in the context of workplace?
So the most important thing is once a person's diagnosed with epilepsy, we then come into the picture and we would start throwing medicines at you, right? So the first step would be to make a decision. Is it a particular site from which this seizure activity is coming from? So you can get a local area network that's gone, or you can get the entire system blowing out. And the good thing is we have medicines that will specifically target a local area network, or we have medicines that can target the entire system, right? What our job and what the job of the medication is to do is to kind of settle that network abnormality, all right? So we would give you a medication based on the type of epilepsy that you might have. By stabilizing that network and stabilizing the person's electrical discharge that's causing the problem, we allow for the network to settle and then for the network to go back to its normal function. And that really is what we're trying to do in the workplace. Once the person's working, once the seizure medication is working, the person is returned back to their communities, their homes, and to their workplace, with the intention that they continue and function in a normalized manner. So that is what our job is, to return the affected individual back into their home environment, into their societal environments, and back into the workspace, so that they can function like everybody else. And nobody needs to know that you have epilepsy unless you want to tell them. So the medication is meant to assist in their normal functional recovery and to assist with control of that network integrity. So that's really what the medications do for you.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. You've given us so much to think about there. Thank you, Pradeep. It's always wonderful to hear from you and hear the metaphors that you give, because it really talks into persons with epilepsy, and that really leads me to our chat with Tim and why he's here today. Tim, you've had epilepsy since you were 10 years old, and can you just give us just insights into what your life has been like with epilepsy, how it's affected you, and certainly then jumping into your work life with epilepsy and your experiences. So yeah, I'd just like to hear a lot from you, Tim.
Okay. Yes, I was diagnosed at the age of 10, and I experienced a few challenges of discrimination at school. I just went to a normal government school in those days, but there was one thing I did learn at school, and that was technical drawing, and I was quite good at technical drawing, and I always put extra effort into this. So at the end of my standard 9 year, my late father worked in a department in the city council, City of Cape Town. And he said, why don't you, the department next door's land survey branch, why don't you come and do a holiday job here and do some mapping? And in those days, there was no such thing as a computer. Everything was drawn by hand, and I had a whole set of equipment. So I joined them, and I earned a salary of 10 Rand a day for my for my services, which was great. And then I'll just jump ahead after matric. I didn't have a lot of confidence in myself or self-esteem, and I wasn't sure what to do in life. And so I just went back to them, and they employed me, and they gave me a position, full-time position, and then put me on various drawing courses, which I aced, which gave me a bit of confidence at the time, and so I knew I had a skill. There were a few things that were lacking as well, and didn't really take note of them at the time. And so I did experience seizures at work. Generally noticed that the more mature people would be around to assist, and there was a place to go and rest. But it was probably more in my mid-20s where I realized a change, and that was when the South African National Epilepsy League, in those days now Epilepsy South Africa, they had some trainee students that were doing a project. So they got me together and interviewed me and one or two other people, and I found this quite therapeutic. You know, when you're in a big office environment or a corporate or whatever, you don't, at the time I didn't know anyone. I didn't know anyone else who had epilepsy. You sort of feel quite alone out there. And having this room of a couple of people that you could share with who experience the same things made me think of starting an Epicare support group called Epicare, and I started a newsletter with that monthly newsletter called The Brainstorm, and I invited doctors and neurologists and all sorts of great people to come and speak, and that was wonderful. But through this, I learned a lot about myself, and it changed my whole perspective on life. I had to look inward and say, but now, and try and understand my condition. I had to learn about myself, about managing my condition, and know exactly what my condition involved. And that is sitting down, what were my triggers? What made me more susceptible to having a seizure? After a seizure, sit down and think back what happened 24 to 48 hours beforehand. And managing, you can get treated medically, but you've got to learn how to deal with the psychosocial side of it. And this is what the EpiCare group was doing. It was helping people with psychosocial part of the condition. And that released a whole lot of stress. We all live with subconscious stress in our lives. I started thinking about things like that, other contributing factors that we don't think about all the time, that build up this subconscious stress in oneself, which can make us more susceptible to having a seizure. And also then working out, how can we, if this caused me to have a seizure, maybe I must work on how, what my threshold would be, and how far can I push myself before and use that as a guide, I also, I found that also creating a network with people at work was very important. You've got to break down all these little bits to make your job easier to do and easier to handle, and networking with people, giving them a little bit of advice or information about epilepsy. I led into that quite subtly with some of them, and then you grab their attention, and all of a sudden they're interested, and it's part of the education. Back then there wasn't much education about it. I also found that in the and that was just inbuilt in me, and it probably still exists today, is that people with epilepsy end up working so much harder to try and prove themselves against others who haven't got epilepsy. You tend to overcompensate, and which isn't a good thing necessarily. And why should you have to compete against your colleague who's doing the same work? But you're just trying to prove a point to whoever is in charge of you, that you can do this as well and even better. And one's got to be cautious about that, because you end up working harder and they're again maybe creating unnecessary stress. So there's a whole balance one's got to work with. One of the things I could say though is talking about this condition with others and sharing, and was a big release. It actually helped me develop further. When I say it changed my whole perspective on life, I became very positive. I was eventually studied civil engineering at the age of 30, and I specialized in traffic engineering. And it's a case of managing one's life well, understanding one's condition well, and having the confidence in oneself, and don't I also find that a lot of people use this condition as a crutch, not to use it as a crutch, but also to a word I'm trying to think of. Yeah.
We're all here with you.
Yeah. So it's having confidence and having the in oneself in doing this job and in doing one's work, and yeah, basically that's how I dealt with my position.
So really managing yourself, Tim, in the
Yes,
workplace and communicating is really my takeaways from everything you're saying. And, you know, yeah, I think, is there something you'd like to add? I saw you just go.
I think it's a case of building connections at work, is knowing the people around you, and them knowing you is also a bit of a release, giving them that sort of education about your condition, what to do, when to do it, and if they are there to help you, and I also found that some people in some careers, they make an issue and we hate this job and so on. We've actually got to make the work environment easy by making the most of what you've got. Jobs are not easy to get. They're not easy for people with epilepsy to get, but so make it a suitable working environment by looking inward, saying, am I the problem? Why my boss is reacting that way? It's your attitude to other people that makes a difference in the workplace. Yeah.
Thank you, Tim. And I think our next question, Shirley, I mean, turning to Nondumiso, we really, you're a large multinational, and we had a very engaged conversation around this. So we have Michael to the right.
Yeah, and I think just to segue from what Tim has mentioned around the work environment, right? So it has to be engaging.
Correct.
Can you take us through the responsibilities of the employer? Because this is a relationship between the employee and the employer. That's the workplace. Just starting off with the legislative framework, what are those responsibilities, legal responsibilities? So
we live in South Africa, and we're fortunate to have a mature and well-entrenched constitution to start with, as also overarching legislation. The constitution gives you rights and protection, and particularly discrimination issues. Now, epilepsy and potential discrimination in the workplace, as Tim's touched on, is a matter of discrimination. It can be. So, and absolutely goes back to the education part for everyone. But in terms of legislation, Nondumiso, it goes back to, we have a constitution, and then below that we have labor laws. And those labor laws, particularly the Employment Equity Act, and there's another act on unfair discrimination. Those acts are entrenched as acts of parliament in South Africa, and they protect everyone.
Okay.
So they definitely protect people with epilepsy, and they protect anyone against unfair discrimination in the workplace. And so that gives people a sense of protection. You shouldn't need to rely on the law, but the law is absolutely there to protect those individuals.
So an employee with epilepsy, is it a requirement then for them to have the benefit of those protections, to disclose to the employer that they have epilepsy?
So no, the short answer is no, there's no requirement by law to disclose. Absolutely, it's a private matter. However, the answer is you as an individual, and really each person needs to look at their situation and decide if they want to disclose to the employer. So it goes back to what they talk about in labor law as reasonable accommodation. And reasonable accommodation is really what can the employer do to accommodate whatever this is. And in this case, we're talking about epilepsy. What can they reasonably do? And I had a conversation with someone earlier, and we were talking about a very simple example of neon lights. So if neon lights and the flickering of lights is a trigger for you as an individual in the workplace, if you choose to disclose, and again, it's your choice, so you've got to look at your circumstances in your employment situation. If you choose to disclose to your employer that neon lights are a trigger, and they're putting you in an open plan office where there's lots of neon lights, for some example, that would be probably a wise decision to make, but you've got to take it in context of the employer relationship. But that would be a good decision to make, because you would say to the employer, those neon lights potentially are a trigger for me. And then what would be a reasonable accommodation? Well, in that case, a reasonable accommodation would be to move you out of that place with all the neon lights and put you in a small secluded office where maybe you don't have it. And all they've got to do is disconnect the neon lights. It doesn't mean spending a lot of money. And put a normal desk lamp or something there to give you lighting. But that would be reasonable accommodation for them then to accommodate you so that you can do your job, which is what it's all about.
I'd like to ask you, Michael, you're saying, you're touching on so many points here. We know epilepsy is a disability, and that's somebody, everybody always asks, is it a disability? Now, talk to us a little bit about the disclosure. At what point should an employee or a potential employee actually disclose that? What is your advice on that?
So, Sharlene, there's no set answer to that, but these are typically the guidelines. And really, it's again, this is a very personal, individual decision each person with epilepsy needs to make. And part of that is looking at the relationship of the person that is going to be your employer. Yeah. So we're talking about a pre-employment relationship here. Yeah. And really, depending on you as an individual too, and maybe, like Tim said, based on your previous experiences you've had in employment relationships and how you were treated. Some people, when they submit their CV and say, I'm applying for X job, will submit a neurologist medical report saying, I suffer from epilepsy, I'm living with it, and this is a medical report proving that. But not everyone's that confident. You don't know what response, as much as it's protected by law, you don't know what subjective responses and potential discrimination you're going to live with, where they're going to treat you differently because now they know. So the answer to that, Sharlene, is to say people don't have to disclose. Yeah. And typically a guideline, if you're not sure and you don't know the employer, it's a new employer, you don't know yet how they're going to treat you if they find out. Yeah. The guideline there is to protect yourself to a point where you get something in writing. And that is, get an offer letter saying you hereby offer you this job at this salary and this job. They sign it, you sign it, or you get an employment contract. Then you're protected by law, and there can be no potential. Because, what people are so afraid of, Sharlene, is that it's not obvious. It's not like, I will discriminate because of. It's not that clear. Mm-hmm. When you're on a short list of 5 candidates and you're one of 5 they're going to choose from, they find out that you've got epilepsy, or they're going to somehow drop you off that list. Is that subjective, subliminal discrimination going to happen? And that's why people don't necessarily disclose up front, because they're afraid of that. And it's not going to be they tell you to your face. They will never. Mm-hmm. But it's going to happen. So be safe. Know that you've got the security of the job offer or the contract, or you've started the job. And then disclose, because you really want the employer, and we encourage people to disclose. But again, when you're comfortable, because we want the employers to make reasonable accommodations. Yeah. And to educate the people you're working with. If you have a seizure, what do people around you do? Because they typically freeze, they're too scared to know what to do. Tell the people around you, educate them, give them first aid training, give them training, let them know that they're working with a person with epilepsy. And that way, that's a reasonable accommodation.
Yeah. So thank you, Michael. You're touching on OHS.
Yes.
You're touching on ergonomics.
Yes.
You're touching on education in the workplace. You're touching on just so much information. And I suppose my last question to you, before I think we want to jump into to more medical side as well, is that, so if I want to disclose, I've got a job, I've started, and now I go to HR.
Yes.
And I disclose. That's confidential, right?
Correct.
Is that confidential?
Absolutely, Sharlene.
Is it handled like that? Does it have to be handled like that?
It has to be, absolutely. From a professional point of view, it's the same as disclosing a medical condition to a doctor. Absolutely. That HR has no right to disclose to anyone else except the person you've disclosed it to. They have no right to disclose, for example, to your line manager. Unless you give them an instruction telling them, I want my manager to know that if I have a seizure, X, Y, Z is the best way to help me at that point in time. If they tell you, that's where it's got to stop. And that is really a professional thing. So absolutely, it's a protected disclosure like that.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. Dr. Rowji, I have a question for you. I know as a neurologist, and the nature of epilepsy being typically a chronic one, you build up very close relationships with your patients. What is the role of the neurologist in assisting a person living with epilepsy and guiding them through some of these challenges in the workplace?
So I'm happy that Tim's raised a few things, but I just want to raise a few other things that we generally encounter. One of them is shift work. So, the problem with epilepsy, I was talking about in networks, now I'm going to talk about waves. So my metaphors get more and more colorful. Okay? So
Which is
epilepsy, unfortunately, is also got a particular way of manifesting. So when you are stressed or tired, you may find you might get a seizure. Alcohol is another one. It lowers the seizure threshold. There's a few things like that. So if your blood sugar drops, you get a seizure. So we always say that there's also another phenomenon that we find with certain types of seizures. They happen at a particular time of day. And so what happens is that we have our day cycle where the brain's going through its usual function and it has a particular pattern in the EEG. And then at night it undergoes a different pattern. You go into the sleep patterns, and there's a whole myriad of things that happen in sleep. And we find a lot of patients develop seizures at night while they're sleeping. And it's almost like the surfer. He has to wait for the perfect opportune moment to catch the perfect wave. And that's what happens with certain epilepsies. They'll come out at a particular time of the night or particular time of the day based on particular circadian rhythms that are going on in the brain. So not only are the networks out, but there's also a particular bunch of waves that are helping that seizure activity go on. So we want our patients not to have, ideally, if they've got badly controlled epilepsy, then we want them not to have shift work. And the reason is, when you have a disruptive sleep pattern, they're more likely to develop all these strange, abnormal seizures based on how they have to adjust on a week-by-week basis to the shift work that they have to accommodate. So that's just one of the things that we would write letters for and suggest to the line managers or to the HR department. We don't know where the letters go, so it's nice to know that Tim probably goes to Tim, or Tim's equivalent in the workspace.
Yeah.
Or not Tim, Michael.
it's still Michael, yeah.
Michael, apologies.
Tim, Michael.
So Michael's equivalent in the workplace. So that would be the person that would receive the letter. But it doesn't always work like that. So we get a bunch of, I remember working in the days of Bera, and you say to the guy, listen, you're not allowed to drive for 2 years. The guy says, I'm a taxi driver.
Yeah.
So what happens there? So we have a constitution that is so outdated. And as far as I know, that the last bit of information was 2 years before you're allowed to drive. Now, not in a country like ours. So we also have to make adjustments in terms of how we advise our patients in terms of driving. So you got to get to work. How else are you going to get to earn a living, right? So we have to adjust for those sorts of things. So we got to advise them about that. Then you get people that work in a manual space, like our lighting, camera guys, etc. They have to go up there and they work, and then he has a seizure up a ladder, which could be a disaster for a person with epilepsy. Falls on his noggin, and that's it. Has a head injury, and that's the end of the day for our poor man. So at the end of the day, we have many, many various challenges that our epileptic patients have to face on a daily basis. So I think there's lots to be said about how we assist our patients, but most of the time we try to mitigate against injury, against discrimination by having them always have to do shift work, etc., because that is an issue for us. And we also get, obviously, the issue with regard to traveling, transport, etc. So we have to try to assist with letters and of motivation to allow for that to happen. And in this era, when there's medical aids, we also have to make sure that the patients get their medicines. And that's another challenge. So we're involved in multiple levels and trying to make sure and to ensure that our patients get their medicines, always re-educating about alcohol and the dangers thereof. But most importantly, in the workplace environment, we try to assist with ensuring that they follow a particular regime when it comes to daytime work and ensuring that they stay on the daytime programs, allowing for employees to assist with that. But generally, and you talked about epilepsy as a disability. Ideally, what we're trying to do is remove that idea of disability. They must be returned to society.
A condition.
Not with a disability, ideally, if we can. Ideally, that is our goal. Unfortunately, it's not always like that. And I think the era that Tim has been highlighting, God willing, that era is slowly moving away. With education, with these kind of forums, we're hoping that the education and the understanding of epilepsy and the risk that a person with epilepsy poses to that space is very negligible. But when they do have a seizure, then they have measures in place to allow for that to happen safely and to have the patient referred to the appropriate healthcare setting.
I think you're touching on a couple of questions here, and I suppose it's bouncing between the two of you, is that you've brought up different types of work for a person with epilepsy, and this is going to open a whole conversation, the two of you, because you've said you're a driver and you have epilepsy, you've been diagnosed, you're on scaffolding, you're going to have a seizure. And let's open the floor. What is your response to that as a person in the workplace living with epilepsy?
So Sharlene, it goes back to what I touched on earlier, which is reasonable accommodation. I mean, I think probably a taxi driver is an extreme example, but if you're, of a challenge. But I think that if you're an employer and an employee comes and have been recently been diagnosed with epilepsy, you need to be able to look at making a reasonable accommodation. So if you work for a company, what can that individual as your employee, what skill set do they have, what can they do? And I mean, for whatever period of time, you as a doctor recommend they don't do what they were doing previously until a certain point in time. What can that employer reasonably accommodate them to do to keep their employment, make sure they're productive, give them a salary, but provide some sort of job and input for the business as well to maintain. And again, medical ideas like that are very good. It gives you guidance as to what...
I don't know if you know, but many times you're driving into Berra, and the taxi driver's got a spanner on as
the steering wheel.
So for starters, if we can just get them to give him a steering wheel, it'll be the best decision that the taxi owner can give him. But there's so many challenges, and I think the more we appreciate it and the more we understand that, you got big companies that are one form of employee, and so they tend to have a lot more capacity to be able to assist, whereas you get an individual with 5 employees, the taxi owner who sits in Soweto or in Alexander, and he's got 3 drivers or 5 drivers. How does he accommodate for that? And I'm sure there's many ways to get around the issue, but I'm sure we can address them. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to do that by educating the employees and then most importantly, making sure that the sufferer, who's our patient, my patient, is cared for and catered for, and that they don't lose their job and be discriminated against, like poor Tim was as a child and as an adult, I'm sure.
Sorry, I just thought I'd raise a thing that your comment actually raised another point, is that the person with epilepsy should also know their limitations and should also be responsible when applying for that job. They have to carry a certain responsibility. They can't go and shouldn't go and apply for a job where they know that they're going to be at a certain amount of risk. So I think there's a bit of responsibility from both sides.
And Sharlene, sorry, this goes back to what we were saying earlier about disclosure or not disclosure. So now understand that you're applying for a job, let's say hypothetically working at heights, you're working in bad temperatures, extreme temperatures, whatever the job is. You want the job. Now the question is, you're afraid possibly to disclose, potentially to that employer, because they're going to say, epilepsy, you're not going up that crane or that ladder. And so that is part of the challenge of not disclosing and then putting yourself, like Tim was saying, applying for a job that is at risk.
That's why I also say is that people with epilepsy need to look inwardly. They need to know their condition well. As I sit here now, I don't have seizures like I used to, because I understand where my triggers and all those things are. I understand my condition well, and so I don't have the problems like I used to. But I think anyone should know that before going to look for any high-risk job. Should know if they can do.
I want to. There's so much to ask.
and I think the question I was going to pose to Dr. Rowji, and I think you're touching on it. Have you had a situation where a person with epilepsy will come to you and say, I am completely incapacitated by it. We've tried everything medically. At what point does it become or get to a point where a person can no longer work from a medical perspective? Have you had those circumstances?
We've got situations, and one thing that which I want to touch on is that we're very fortunate living in South Africa. So firstly, we have access to most of the medications that are available to anyone else in the globe. So that's number one. The second point is that if you fail your one or the first medical management. We have a second and a third agent that we can still try. And so we always have this rule that 70%, even if we choose the wrong drug, will get better with that first drug. And then we kind of wean them through a whole process. But generally speaking, we select drugs that are specific for their seizure type. They get better, or they don't get better, or they get better and then they have a relapse. Then we would choose a second agent. And ideally, we want patients on one drug, because you must remember the side effects. Besides all of that, remember the side effects of our medications. They all work on the brain. They're all going to affect your ability to sleep, your ability to communicate, your ability to concentrate on the job, your ability to, there's so many different things, and they're all working on the brain, which is where you're applying yourself on a day-to-day basis at the workplace. So we got drugs that are obviously going to affect that work function of yours. So we have all of those things. So we have medicines that are working well, and then we have to use a second drug. So then we use second drug reluctantly. We try it. Person still breaks through and has another seizure. We have options of adding a third agent and a fourth agent. And sometimes even with that, we still can't break the seizures. And then we would call them refractory epileptics. And the refractory epileptic now becomes a problem, because in the workplace, if they're working and they're having the Michael Jackson moment and having a dance on the floor, it becomes a problem, because not only does that patient then have to deal with their own personal illness, they also have to deal with the psychological effects it has on the other co-workers. And their own confidence gets eroded terribly. Then they don't want to get up to go to work because they can't, and then there's that fear they're going to have another seizure, and then that cycle becomes quite vicious. But we have a solution for them as well. So we have other options. So there's a thing called a vagal nerve stimulator, which we can use, and it's an old modality, still has its place, although falling out of favor in this era, but there's still a possibility. There's also now in this era epilepsy surgery, and there's really, we have one major center, and it's run in Cape Town, where a lot of our patients go to have their assessments done, and once they've assessed and worked out, they put electrodes around your brain, unlike the ones that we use in the normal clinical setting, and then they map it down to a bunch of cells that could be the trigger. And then they would do a surgery for that bunch of surgery for patients. And we have gotten patients right off all medications and cured them of the epilepsy. So there are options in terms of medical management. And now there's a few other modalities, surgical modalities, and also a bunch of extracranial management options that we try, like magnetic stimulation. But they're still in the experimental stages. But the surgical routes are still possible. So yes, there are many ways to encounter the problem. But then, after years of having had seizures, sometimes there's long-term injury that we create in the patient's brain. But not many patients encounter that. So we're really talking about a very small pool of patients. So if we were to imagine that 1%, prevalence of 1% of our population, we're talking about 600,000 people. Of that 600,000 in our country, we're looking at maybe 6 patients. So it's a marginal number of patients that have ultimately developed a disability. But that's only for those patients that we would regard as normally functional. Then you get the epilepsies which damage the brain and are a symptom of the damage that's going on. That's a separate subgroup of patients that we're talking about. So I'm talking about the normal epileptic who, like Tim, has been through educational standards, been through all of that, and then still manages to become, in the concept of of epilepsy as refractory epileptics. There are options that are available.
Okay. I'd like to, there's 2 points that one is we've talked about education of persons with epilepsy as critical, and that's why Sanofi and Epilepsy South Africa are sitting here today. But there's 2 things. Is the one that, and I'd like to ask both of you. The first thing is that, Tim, what level of support have you had in the workplace, in your life, during your life? So the good, the bad, and the ugly. And if you could expound on that, and then also you touched on driving. So maybe, I know that we're going to park that, I think, for now, Pradeep, and we'll come back to that. But if you could just share with us just the good, the bad, and ugly in terms of supported work. I know it's quite difficult, but just things that have worked, where you felt supported, where you haven't, how it's been managed.
Okay. I came from a very supportive family to start with, and they were always there for me. And And I guess once I went to, and of course having my father in the next department, it led on, and people did support me there. Nobody really discriminated against me at all in the office. Well, I wasn't aware of it. There was always a concern that maybe I would be sort of not accepted for a better position because of my condition. But and many as I did apply, I wasn't sort of aware of that either. But I did have a problem at one stage where I wasn't able to drive, and I had a nasty crash when I was at the age of 30, so I didn't drive for a few years. But I mean, I got over that. So it all came down to reviewing my life and managing myself. But driving is, I need to be able to drive for my job in any way. So
you've been quite supported in the workplace through your career as a person with epilepsy. And that's amazing to hear. I think that's encouraging for a lot of people, and hearing the label law supports discrimination and supports everybody. And then the guidelines in terms of work and what type of work can somebody be doing. I mean, we're having a really robust conversation here, and it's really interesting. I mean, again, you're talking about having an accident with driving. And what is the medical advice with driving, Dr. Rowji? Because it is an unknown.
Well, I remember many years reading our constitution, and it was 2 years. And I don't know that they've actually updated that to anything different. That's an old British kind of copy from the British Constitution. So I'm not sure that we've had a recent review of that. We as a society have had opportunity to review it and have discussed it. And our guidelines are based on what we see around the globe. And one of the areas that kind of compares to South Africa would be the Americas, where they don't have as good a public system of transportation. And so you would have to rely on your own personal means of transport. And there we say that if you haven't had a seizure for 3 months, some people will go as far as saying 6 months perhaps, for those that have had and have been naughty and continue to drink or whatever, kind of a little bit of a punishment, I think, which is not always right. But 3 months is what we would consider as a safe enough period. So if you've had a seizure yesterday and for the next 3 months, to date, on the 1st of 3 months from now, the person hasn't had a seizure and has no glimmer of it, we would say that you're now adequately controlled based on the medications and based on the fact that we've asked you not to drink and we've asked you to follow a regime of making sure you don't skip meals, etc. And based on the fact that you then comply and you understand, and like Tim says, to take control of your illness, because that's the one thing that is vital. A lot of patients don't take control of their illness. Yeah. And then they become victims of the illness, which is unfortunate. So when you've taken control of your illness, you understand the concepts of what we're trying to mitigate against, and you've had 3 months without a seizure, we would say then you're relatively safe. And then, if you continue that behavior pattern and understand the safety kind of space that you need to be in, I think 3 months would be an adequate time frame.
Interesting.
And I was just thinking now, I think the example is around driving, but there may be different job types in a workplace. Or perhaps you have examples also of how an employer can accommodate somebody without losing that employee. Could they perhaps, you gave the example of the flickering light, could they be moved elsewhere? Could they be reskilled to do another job? So perhaps, yes, you hired them as a driver, but there's something where they would be at less risk. If you can just talk us through some of those examples, maybe for HR people out there who are listening.
Yes. So I think that that's a good question. And I mean, I think the driving is a very good example because many people can relate to that. So obviously depending on the size of the organization, but I mean, you were talking about an organization with 30,000 employees. So, with a large organization, reasonable accommodation is obviously more available. And this goes back to HR concepts which is cross-skilling, up-training of staff. So you're a driver, but ultimately you want the person to progress in their career. So you want to give them other skill sets along the way. And that's exactly when, potentially, and the example of a driver, I mean, in my mind, I think it must have depending on the organization again, but if a person's a driver, it doesn't mean that for those, let's say you book them off for 3 months in terms of driving, so that they can't be something like a warehouse clerk or some sort of administrative role, and that's where the cross-skilling comes in, that they cannot only be a driver in life. Mm-hmm. So they would absolutely be able to take on another role on a temporary basis. And then they would actually be able to retain their job, get paid, the organization would retain their skill set. In the long term, they'd be able to go back to driving after being reassessed by the medical people. That's exactly how they should be accommodated.
Mm. Can I ask you just something? You've spoken about the labor law.
Yes.
And if somebody is experiencing discrimination, I mean, Tim has never experienced discrimination. I have people coming and asking all the time is, where do they go? How do they get help when they are experiencing discrimination? What do you advise, Michael?
So discrimination is covered by a number of laws. I mean, it's covered by the Constitution as this overarching law, which covers everything in this country. But I mean, it's relegated down to the Employment Equity Act, which specifically talks about unfair discrimination. And really, I think that it's a difficult question, Sharlene, because if someone's experiencing discrimination, and let's say hypothetically it's from their line manager, it's very easy to say to them, go and report that person, and et cetera, et cetera. And absolutely, the law will protect that individual who's being discriminated against. Absolutely, they've got the law on their side. The reality is they're dealing with an individual who's in charge of them. So the answer is you need to look at your relationship and the hierarchy and the organization.
Okay.
But typically, you should take it up. So the answer would be, if you don't want to speak to your manager about it, and you can't confront them, which is probably not realistic and often, you take it to the HR department, which is an independent group within the organization, and they should then be able to look at it and discuss it with that person. And then you get senior executives involved if necessary, all with the law on your side. All of this is for you protecting all this. And again, you just go up until you get someone who's going to actually take it on and protect you. But you have the law protecting you, and ultimately you need someone to, and then that situation itself. So someone in a senior position speaks to that line manager, whoever's the person that's discriminating and causing the problem, and they remedy that problem, and it hopefully goes away.
It's just such subtle discrimination, isn't it, Michael?
Yeah.
And it's so difficult for a person that is employed to almost prove that they're being discriminated because of their epilepsy.
And Sharlene, even more so when it's a position of power over that person, so a manager or someone more senior. Absolutely, you're right.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Would you like to add more, or we have a little bit of time and let's just I think unpack this more.
I think the issue of stigma and discrimination, I think across various disease areas is very important. But earlier, Tim and I had a conversation about internalized discrimination, right? So where somebody might assume that there is discrimination, or people will discriminate against them because of their condition, and that might play out maybe in their self-esteem or their confidence in the workplace. I just thought it would be something that would be worth sharing again, and your thoughts about internalized discrimination as somebody living with epilepsy.
I think I mentioned about people being pushed down, and I think I was probably at the time referring to my experiences back at school, and this you can relate to what could happen in the work environment. Is whereas I had staff at school saying, well, sorry, you can't swim for the school anymore because you had a seizure, and then you can't do this sport and you can't do that sport, and eventually I think they were happy that I didn't do any sport. Sure. And so I left and I did my cycling as my getaway, and that is people tend to get pushed down, and I think it's a case of we have to try and build ourselves up and face up to these things. And that's why I say about managing our condition well, and we have to stand up to people. You've talked about the HR as well, and I think positivity, overcoming that self-esteem and confidence is a big thing. I found in my life, and it pushed me on. Once I'd got over that hurdle, I realized I could actually do a lot more with my life, and actually epilepsy ended up being the least thing on my mind. And in fact, I somehow managed to forget about my epilepsy, because epilepsy was one of these things on your shoulder. Shall I do this? No, well, maybe it's a bit, and it was always in the background. If you've managed your condition well and you've had your medicines and you've done all the right things, it should be something of the past that you can now live with and get on with your life. Don't sit and dwell on all the negatives of it.
I think,
stick
Tim,
your neck out.
You are touching on something so critical here, because it is in the management. It is in, I'm a person living with epilepsy, and it is just getting on with life and managing your epilepsy. And there's stress. Stress is such a silent killer with so many things. We're all just nodding because we live in such a stressed society. Dr. Rowji, I've had a question that an individual is asking, and I think it's such a relevant question for you. The question goes like this: I have epilepsy. Does it travel around my brain, or is it only in one place? What happens with my epilepsy?
So you get patients that have a focal form of epilepsy where just the hand might twitch for a few hours. We call that focals. It's coming from right hand, will be coming from the left side of the brain in an area called the motor cortex, so it'll be twitching away. So that's a focal epilepsy. It stays focal. Then we get those that can affect consciousness and your appreciation of what's happening around you. We call those complex partials. And during that period, that person's still having a focal seizure, but they're unaware of their surroundings.
Okay.
And then you have the generalized epilepsy, where generally it starts deeper within the segments of the brain, and then it spreads to all hemispheres. The most important point to make is that you get focal onset, which can become generalized. So the one network goes down. This is ESCOM revisited. one network goes down in Soweto, and then the next thing you know, Greater Joburg area gets knocked out. So it does spread. It does travel. So yes, we get generally the low focal seizures that can travel, or you can have the generalized, which doesn't require anybody to just. That's when ESCOM power capacity goes down, and Medupi and a few others go out. They're essential.
It just maybe on the issue of management of epilepsy, and I think, Tim, you might also have some additional insights around that. The multidisciplinary team that would assist an individual with epilepsy and how they show up in the workplace. Can you speak to some of those important people as well, over and above the neurologists that maybe we can start with you, Dr. Rowji, that you've worked with, and then Tim, any that you also felt contributed to your employee experience?
So the multidisciplinary team concept, and that theme is vital for everything we do in medicine. I must say, working in South Africa, that theme hasn't really followed through in the South African context. In the UK, they have lots of people that would assist that person integrating back into their workspace. So you could have an OT, etc. Also there, the HR interacts with the social workers, and so they have a great deal. But in South Africa, I don't know that we have such support services that are going to help the person living with epilepsy move into the workspace or just cope with their home environment, for example, So I think we really are far behind in that conversation and in the actual manifestations in the workspace. I'm not sure what your experience has been so far, Tim.
Well, yes, I did. that is where there was a gap in my life. Is that we had the medical treatment, we had the support from the family and people in the workspace, but there was the lack of the social support type thing. How do you integrate socially with people? How do you and the education, the education, because now going back in time, education wasn't a big thing, and we've got better education now in epilepsy, but it was a case of trying to the support groups that I put together brought people together and got them talking and sharing one another, and that was a very important thing. And I know now there are probably other groups that are online more, and Facebook groups and that. But and I think that's very important. At work, I'm connected with a lot of people. I network with a lot of people at work, and they don't sort of see me as a person with epilepsy because they don't. Maybe not all of them know even. Because I work at all sorts of levels, and I'm sure some of them don't. But there are times when I have spoken about it to people, and especially when it's been Ticky Ticks week and so on, I run around with put up a couple of posters. What is that? Oh, this is for Epilepsy South Africa, and then it starts a conversation. So.
Just we've got a few minutes, and so I'm just kind of fielding some of the questions that are coming through. So the one question, and I'd like to actually direct it to you again. Okay, how important is diet and supplements with a person of epilepsy? How important is that in our lives? Is it relevant to controlling our epilepsy?
So we have epilepsies that start off in early childhood, very, very early childhood, soon after they're born. There, the epilepsies may be triggered by metabolic abnormalities. So what we mean by metabolic abnormalities is that you eat food, the food goes into your system, the engine has to work, your body converts protein via a particular pathway, converts fat via a different pathway, it converts glucose and carbohydrates via a different pathway. And those pathways are metabolic pathways. And so if there's an abnormality of one of those pathways, the body tries to circumvent it and change routes. And then you can get a whole variety of abnormalities of enzymes that can give rise to this. So you can get seizures from that particular abnormality. A classic example is a movie that I'm not sure if people have heard of it. It's called Lorenzo's Oil. And in that particular case, there's a story about this young kiddie whose parents, it's a real life story, became a movie, but actually there is a real biological story there, where this family discovered that this child had an abnormality of metabolizing very long-chain fatty acids. And that resulted in a particular abnormality with the brain deformities and associated epilepsy. And they tried, by changing the patient's diet, tried to control the epilepsy, and they were successful at it.
Okay.
And from there comes this whole concept of keto diets. And so there are some people that we would actually use keto diets in, but not everybody is eligible to that. So when we talk about the refractory epileptics that I was talking about earlier, when all medicines are failing, then we even try the ketogenic diet in that particular setting. But if you have a normal, healthy adult eating a naturally, not a processed, not too much processed, but a naturally derived food sources like meat, in the form of protein, or good proteins from vegetables, fruit, vegetables, and the rest of it, avoiding the alcohol. Generally speaking, we shouldn't expect to have them supplement with any supplements. And that goes for any health condition. And then talking about the supplements, you must remember some of the supplements could be dangerous for you. I'll give you an example. Too much fish oil in the form of omega-3 can cause you to bleed. So if you have epilepsy and then you fall and then you just bleed out, it might be the omega-3s. So just be wary about, apart from the fact that there's not always a need for supplements, there's some supplements that could be a problem. So just be wary. Discuss it with your healthcare provider. Research it. These days, information is available on the tap of a button. Go to Google, ask Google to give you an answer. So there's lots of ways to research it, and then most importantly, discuss it with people that, like Tim has set up Epilepsy South Africa. There's lots of support groups. Discuss it with them, because some people might have experience. And then lastly, there's always a healthcare provider that could provide you with that sort of information.
And I think that brings us to the last question that we're going to take, because each of us will be having 5 minutes to chat post this to one of the cameras, and it will be broadcast live again. But I've had a very interesting question posed to us, and it talks to Michael and to Dr. Rowji and to Tim, is that this person's not on medical aid. They have a seizure at work. How with a lack of support, unable to go to a private facility, what do they do? How do they manage this?
So
give it over to you to start with,
my
Michael.
part of the answer would be to say it goes back to reasonable accommodation. So absolutely, if we're dealing with an HR sense, a person having a seizure at work, firstly, we need to make them safe and all that. But secondly, the reasonable accommodation would be to say, how do we accommodate them? So if they need to go home for the rest of the day, whether they go to a doctor or not, that would be reasonable. And the same applies to time off for medical appointments. If you have epilepsy, you need to have time off. That's reasonable accommodation. An employer should do that and give that. Okay. So, Sharlene, that's my answer.
Okay, thank you. Would either of you like to add to that? Because then we're going to start wrapping up, and we'll chat further on later on.
I just wanted to add, you talking about, off your question a bit, about food and supplements and things like that. One thing that has helped me when I've had, auras and so on, is if I've had water to drink, lots of water to drink, and also keeping oneself hydrated, not over-hydrated, but enough. And I find that has helped me. And have you experienced that with any other?
So when it's a focal onset seizure, if you distract, we believe that might be assisting, like you're drinking water, so you shifting that focus. You feel it coming on, and you're changing your neural network. It's like changing from MTN to Cell C, because the phones, so it might be the network, so we just suddenly change SIM cards. Okay. And hopefully we get away with it. Sometimes it might be the explanation. I'm not sure, but I think that might be the explanation. But talking to that conversation about the one thing that South Africa and most South Africans can't claim is that they don't have access to healthcare facilities. I've worked at Baragwanath Hospital, I've worked at the Joburg Gen, and I'm sure most of our local clinics have access to medicine. So I think we are in a very privileged position, being in the southern tip of Africa, in that we have access to all the medicines, and most of our clinics will be able to assist you. So even if you don't have a medical aid, you will be able to get your medicines. Whether they'll accommodate that you go and fetch the medicines, because the queues at our local clinics can be disastrously long.
Correct.
So that you'll have to accommodate, that has to be done. And ideally, we should be able to assist with that. Okay. But generally speaking, our patients with epilepsy in this country are very privileged in that we can get medical care when you need it. You can be, even if you're sitting in Lower Sabi, or well, you shouldn't be in Lower Sabi, but in Umtata or further south of Umtata, you could get referred along the pathway, and we have pathways where you will get ultimately a conversation with a neurologist or a trainee neurologist or a qualified professional to be able to care for your condition, choose the right drug, and get you back into the system. So I think we're very privileged in that regard. So even if you don't have a medical aid, you should be cared for very well if you have epilepsy. And if you're still not able to, there's still the organizations, Epilepsy South Africa, and there's so many ways to overcome the challenges that one might face as a person suffering or living with epilepsy. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. I'd like to just thank the four of you as a panel. I think it's been an amazing conversation today, and discussing epilepsy in the workplace is just one of a real topical, critical thing that we've addressed today. So I'd like to thank every single one of you that have joined us today, including our panelists. And everything about these conversations and about Epilepsy South Africa is about providing education, and assisting you in creating a quality of life. And go to our website, epilepsy.org.za. We've got a library of information there. Reach out to our centres nationally, and there is help, there is hope for every single one of you that are living with epilepsy, that are finding the challenges. Life is difficult, but there is hope, and there is the support that you need out there. You just have to ask. So thank you again one and all for joining us. Thank you to our panelists, and have a really good rest of your day. Thank you.